What did happen in the contemporary times, though, is that this discussion was brought up again. Okay. But the reason for why it was brought up again in the 20th century was very, very different to why those opinions existed in the earlier centuries. The reason why the opinion of the prophets of the Quran being the prophet's word existed in the earlier centuries was for some other reason. Because, for example, they would say, some of them would say the kalam of Allah, because it is part of the essence of Allah, it is simple. It is not a compound. It is not a compound thing. Whereas the Quran, which is words that we see in the book, these are compounds. These are murakkab. So how can this text be the kalam of Allah when the kalam of Allah is simple? Whereas this is compound. So the compound can only be somebody who is dependent and limited. So this must be the words of the Prophet. Okay. These type of reasons, caused them or led them to say that this is the word of the Prophet. But in the 20th century, the reason for why this discussion came up again was something completely different. Okay. Why? In the 20th century, the reason why this discussion came up is because of the entire debate on science versus religion. Okay, on science versus religion. And I think perhaps many of you may not be familiar with may not know that this whole science versus religion debate, or, science versus Islam or whatever, Christianity, science versus Christianity. Many of you may not be familiar with how severe and how serious this discussion was. Okay. And it still is, somewhat still is, right? Guys, it was a huge discussion and a huge controversy, because for centuries and centuries and centuries, Muslims and even Christians, with the Bible, for example, they had a certain hermeneutics to interpret their texts, and they were also, a lot of the scholars were also deriving truths about the physical world from the Quran, let's say. Now with modern science, when these things came under scrutiny and questioning, then that opens up an entire can of worms as to what's going on with the Quran. Because some of them were saying, well, no, the literal Quran is saying, for example, the earth is flat. For example, we had our own Shia scholars who believe the earth is flat. Why? Because the hadith and Quran are clear that the earth is flat. Okay, this was their opinion. So now science, modern science is saying that it's not flat. So how do we resolve this? One of the ways that some people began to think that we can resolve this is by saying that the words are the Prophet's words, the meanings are Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, but the words are the Prophet's. So the meaning, there is something behind the words, which is the essence of the Quran, which is the meaning of the Quran. But the words, the Prophet didn't have a choice. He had to use the language that he was, accustomed to, and the Arabs would have understood. So what they're going to try and do is that when this science versus religion conflict happens, they'll be able to get out of it and say, yeah, this is contextual to that time. Yes, the Quran does say the earth is flat, but the deeper meaning here was something else, for example. That was one of the reasons that led them now to push this idea of that this is the Prophet's own words. So see, the reasoning is changed now. And also the arguments are going to change as well. Okay, previously they were arguing, the kalam of Allah is simple and it cannot be compound, or some would say that it is, an arad and not a johar, and it's not the essence and so on. Those arguments are also going to change. You will have newer types of arguments that are going to appear. Okay,